Hello? Is this plugged in? Is that plugged in? I did. The light's on. Hello? Is there volume control? Okay, but I'm going to be moving around. I don't think this is working. 1, 2, 3. I don't think this is working, Father Sir. I don't think this is working. It's lit.
I'm not convinced that really goes too much.
Okay. All right. That one's working, yeah. Although we're going to move back into the dark things at some point for a while. But that's okay. I'll mention it so that anybody online hears it. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Where's Mike? Okay, well, let's start with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, word ever present and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us, cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Amen. Okay, today we're going to talk, I've called this orientation to worship. And the word orientation is very appropriate because it refers to the Orient, to the East. And when all Orthodox churches, if possible, are built facing east, that is, the altar is in the east, and the outside door is to the west. If for some reason you have a piece of land where it's impossible to build that way, or you buy a church that formerly, say, was a Protestant church or a Catholic church or whatever, then the bishop might bless you to not have the worship space facing east. But basically it faces east. Why do you think it would face east? Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. It also says that, let's see, when he appears, it'll be like a lightning flash. I think it says from the east to the west. I'm not sure. I'd have to look that one up. But basically, the idea is that, well, now, those of you who are Orthodox will know what we sing on Christmas. Thy nativity, O Christ our God, has shown to the world the light of wisdom. For by it those who worship the stars were taught by a star to adore thee, the Sun of righteousness, and to know thee, the Orient, from on high. So the idea is that Christ is the light of the world. He's the sun that rises on the world and enlightens mankind. So that we have our churches facing east to symbolize that they're facing toward Christ and giving thanks for this great light that has dawned on us with the incarnation. So they're not, as you might, some people might think, well, maybe they're oriented toward Jerusalem the way mosques are oriented toward Mecca, but that's not the case. If you had a church that was built east of Jerusalem, it wouldn't face a different direction. It would still face east. So. I don't know whether the temple faced east. That's a good question. It might have, but I don't know that. And I wanted to make some general remarks about Orthodox worship before we go. We're going to sort of take a tour of the temple. We'll go to the narthex, which is the entryway, and then we'll come back in here and talk about all the things that are in the church. So it's very informal, and I know at least a couple of people might be watching this online. There might be times when you can't hear me, so I apologize for that, and so I may disappear for a while, and then we'll come back. So be patient, and anything you miss next time you're here, I'll be glad to give you a 10-minute makeup session. So, okay. When we say the church, the ecclesia, as it is in Greek, it means the assembly. And it really refers primarily to the people, but we also, of course, refer to our church buildings as churches. However, in Greek, that's a separate word, naos, from which we get the word nave, which is the central part of the church. And a naos is a temple. So we sometimes do refer to, when we want to make clear that we're talking not about the congregation, but about the building, we can refer to the temple, or to talk about this area is the temple and over there is the social hall. So we can use that expression. So we're going to take a short tour of the narthex, which is the entryway by which you came in from the west. And by the way, if we had iconography all over our church, probably on the west wall, so that you see it as you depart and go out into the world, would probably be the Last Judgment. Or perhaps the falling asleep of the Virgin Mary with the apostles gathered around her. Then you might see that too, as something to remember as we leave the temple. Yes, on the west wall. And when someone is baptized, we start the service out here in the narthex. And symbolically, the west is the direction of the devil. And so the person to be baptized would stand here, and one of the first things that would occur in the service is that the person would renounce the devil. The priest would say, "Do you renounce the devil and all his works and all his pride, all his pomp?" And you would say, "I do renounce him." And then you'd be asked, you'd do that 3 times, and you'd be asked to spit on the floor to show your contempt for the devil. And actually the prayers in baptism are wonderful, what we call the exorcisms, because they say, "We put you under ban, O devil." And we say, "You who don't even have authority over swine," going back to when Christ made the Gadarene swine go into lake there. So come on in here. And when you come into an Orthodox church, it's very appropriate to make the sign of the cross, maybe when you first come up to the front doors. And then when you enter the sanctuary proper, that is the nave. And then typically people will light a candle. If you don't have $1 to offer a candle, don't worry about it. It's not like required that you light a candle every time, but it's a pious custom that many people observe very strictly to light at least one candle when they come in. Some people will light a whole bunch of candles, one as a prayer for each person that they want to especially remember that day. And that's a very pious custom. So we have candles here, and there's a slot to put your money in. And it's sort of honor system, so if you want to put in a $5 bill and have that last you all month, that's fine. You don't have to necessarily have $1 bills. Welcome. So we're just talking about the narthex here. So there are 3 parts to every Orthodox church. There's the narthex, which just means a vestibule. There's the nave, which is where the people sit. And there's, we often call it the altar, or the altar area, the area behind the icon screen that's at the front of the church and where the altar table is. You could call it the sanctuary, but that's a little confusing because the nave is a sanctuary too. It's all a holy place. And those 3 parts of the Orthodox Church correspond to the 3 parts of the temple in Jerusalem. There was an outer courtyard where anyone could go and worship, and then there was the holy place where only the priest could go. And then there was the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest would go once a year. So now in Christ, we've all been sort of moved up. It's that in the early church, people who were not yet baptized could not witness the Eucharist. They would be there for part of it to do the opening psalms, which we call antiphons, and then they would be dismissed before the creed, because you weren't taught the creed until it was like the last thing you learned right before you were baptized. And in fact, it might be the first time you said the creed was in your baptismal service. Let's see, what else do I want to explain out here? We have a little tray here where, and there'll be breads, little small breads here that you can offer for $2. Those are for the priest to remember people you have asked to be remembered in prayer. And what you do is you take one of these little slips here, and you put just the first name of the person you want the priest to pray for. There's a column for living people and a copy for the departed. And when the priest cuts up the bread that is used for the Eucharist, he takes a section from one loaf that's called the lamb, and that will become Holy Communion. And then he takes little particles out of the loaves for the Virgin Mary, for the saints. There's 9 different ranks of saints that he remembers, and then for the living and the departed that people have asked him to pray for. And if you come very early in the morning and you hear the service that's going on even before the reader starts to read the 3rd hour, which is all before Divine Liturgy starts, the priest is doing a little service called the proscomedia, where he prepares the bread and wine. Hey, welcome. We're doing a tour right out here, so come along. And let's see. So those are just the 2 things I wanted to mention in the narthex. If you go to a very, very strict monastery, if you're not Orthodox or not Orthodox yet, or they might not let you go into the main building, they might make you stay in the narthex. So be prepared for that. Most of our monasteries that we have in the Orthodox Church in America are not like that. They realize that the toothpaste is out of the tube, so to speak. Anyone can come and visit the Divine Liturgy. It's not like it was in the early church where people weren't allowed to witness the mysteries. So let's go on into the church and pretend we're entering the church. And it's very appropriate to cross yourself as you enter. We used to have a lady from Ethiopia in our parish, and I thought it was beautiful because the moment she came in the church door, she'd like fall on her face and bow to the ground. It was beautiful. So, yeah. Yeah, the Ethiopians take their shoes off too, right? That's right. I remember when in another parish I was at on Easter at the midnight service, the Ethiopian members of the parish would come in their white robes and they would be barefoot as they went up to receive communion. It's a beautiful custom. So. So this little stand is called an analogion. And you could just call it an icon stand if you can't remember the fancy Greek word. But on it you'll see we have an icon that usually it'll be an icon that pertains to the particular feast day or season of the year. And today we have for tomorrow's celebration of all the saints of America, of North America, who are depicted in this icon. And then the newly canonized Saint Olga of Alaska. You'll hear people call her Matushka Olga. Matushka is an honorary title that we give the priest's wife, and it means little mother. So here's our Matushka. So it's very affectionate terms, and every Orthodox nationality has its own word for the priest's wife. She's a presbytera in Greek, she's a kuria in Arabic, and protonitsa, yeah, is another one, yeah. And I one time was looking at the website of a church in the American South where it was a very heavily, converts from Baptist, and they called the priest's wife the First Lady, which is something Baptists sometimes do, so. First Lady. So the idea is, she's given a special kind of honor. And she's the first female saint, North American saint that we have. And so that's exciting for all of us. And she was an ordinary person. She wasn't a bishop. She wasn't a missionary. She just lived a life of humble service. So, and you can still find the service celebrating her, we call it a glorification. The canonization service is called the glorification. So you can still find that online if you look for it. So.
You just have to
Yeah, you can probably Google on Saint Olga. Yeah, right. It'll be on oca.org too, which has a wealth of information. Now, when people approach the icons, and non-Orthodox people can do this if they feel moved to do so. If they don't feel comfortable doing it, that's fine too. But typically, people would at least make the sign of the cross before they kiss the icons. If during COVID, we weren't doing a lot of, unnecessary kissing of things, so people maybe would just bow to the icon, and some people still prefer to do that. And so it's good to just stand before the icon a moment, if there's not a long line of people, and just look at it and see if you can understand what's portrayed. Maybe try to read what's there if it's in a language you understand. If it's not, you have to give up, ask somebody.
We just ask them to pray for us.
Right, and ask them to pray for you. Yeah, and just in general, the veneration of the saints is worship is only for God, but we venerate and honor saints and icons, and we venerate and honor Christ in those people depicted in the icons. It's because they led a Christ-like life, and so we're honoring Christ in them as they lived out his life. And so probably the simplest thing is people just make the sign of the cross, kiss the icons. If there are two, kiss them both. Some people do something more elaborate. They might cross themselves and then go like this, which is called a metania. I think the word is on here. Yeah, it is, under G, so you don't need to write it down. But a metania is simply a bow from the waist, and you do it like this. If you can't reach the floor, that's okay. Ideally, it would be touching the floor, but if you can't reach the floor, there's no need to squat to reach the floor. You want it to be a gesture that's dignified to give honor to God. Some people might cross themselves twice before they kiss the icon and once afterward. Others might cross themselves 3 times before they kiss the icon. If the cross is here, as it is for the feasts of the cross in September, and then there's one during Lent, then you would, if the cross is here, then you would do a full prostration. And I'll demonstrate a prostration, which is, now if we call the metania a bow from the waist, the prostration is defined as a bow to the ground. And so you'd make the sign of the cross and then get down like this and touch your forehead to the ground. And of course, it would be done in the direction of the icons. And I'll give you a hint. Before you do it, practice it at home so you know whether you can get up again. And it helps if instead of just sort of plopping down, you kind of rock down and then rock back. And that way you kind of have the momentum to get up again. So it's always okay. And if you want to show reverence but can't do that, you can always do the bow from the waist, even if it's just a little bit, that's fine. Standing is the default posture for prayer in the Orthodox Church. We can sit to listen to things like long psalm readings or the epistle, but during the gospel is a time when everyone should try to stand up. However, if you're in pain or physically unable for any reason, you can always sit. There's no one's going to think less of you. So, and if someone is watching what you're doing, that's their problem. They should not be watching you. They should be paying attention to their own piety. So, and then I want to talk to you about the sign of the cross. When we make the sign of the cross, we do it with 3 fingers united like this to represent the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then the 2 fingers that go down into your hand, the other 2 fingers, represent the 2 natures of Christ, that he was fully God and fully man. And that's a very important concept, and the ecumenical councils taught that. And I like the saying that he wasn't half God and half man. He was 100% God and 100% man. And also, we can think of Christ uniting those two natures and then coming down to earth to save us. So the hands descend into the hand like that. And you should try to make the sign of the cross boldly. It's a prayer you can offer without words. And although you will see people just kind of do this. That's okay too. That's their custom. And by the way, all of these things are, they're beautiful customs. You have some freedom to do them as you wish and the ways that work for you. If you go to the monastery, there's a women's monastery in Michigan, you'll see during the services, you'll see one nun's down on her face on the floor, one is kneeling, one is standing, one's tending the candles, one's sitting, depending on their... that too. By the way, there's one of the, I can't remember who it was, but one of the monastic saints said, somebody said to him, "Oh, those brothers are falling asleep during services. Father, what should we do?" And he says, "As for me, if I see one of the brothers falling asleep, I put his head on my knee so he can rest." So I think that's the way to regard people who maybe aren't doing all the things that we can do. Yeah. Monasteries have very long services. And now let's see, what else is on my list? The church architecture. Now, the earliest form of church architecture was, of course, the very earliest Christians met in homes. As we can see from the epistles of St. Paul, they'll talk about the people who met at so-and-so's house. But then public buildings were usually built in the basilica form where you had a long hall with columns down either side. And you can see traces of that in the fact that we have columns here. But over time, it started to become the custom more and more to build churches in the shape of a cross. And the little scraps of paper on which that had a picture on them, I didn't have enough for everybody, but if you have one, share it with somebody who doesn't have one. Let them look at it. It's just a picture from Google Earth of this building. And you can kind of see that even though it's not, this is basically a rectangle, it has some remnants of the cross idea and the fact that these columns separate out a cross-shaped area. And if you look down on it from above, you'll see that the roof has a cross shape, the upper parts of the roof. So that's still there. And then that cross shape made it possible to put a dome on 4 columns like this. And the dome represents the dome of heaven. So that it's an embracing shape. It's a beautiful thing. And often we show Christ in the pose we call the Pantocrator, which means ruler of all, or all ruler, which shows Christ as he will appear at his second coming. So he's there in the dome blessing us. Oh, and that gives me opportunity to mention the other thing about the sign of the cross is the way the priest makes the sign of the cross when he blesses us. When he blesses himself, he does it the way we do it. But when he blesses us, he holds his hands. And I always have to think about this. Here we go. Okay, the Greek initials of Jesus Christ, they would use the first and last letters of Isus Christos for Jesus Christ. So they look like ICXC in English. And so this is the I, this is the C, this is the X, and this is the other C. Yeah. You didn't know that? Oh. And when he blesses us, it's the mirror image of how we bless ourselves, too, which is interesting. I think the reason that the West started to cross itself in the other direction is they were doing what the priest did instead of the mirror image of what the priest did. Because there was a time, we have some evidence in manuscripts, that the West made the sign of the cross from right to left, the way we do. But that disappeared maybe 12th century, something like that. And by the way, the 3 fingers was not always the case. In the early church, I don't know exactly when it changed, they used 2 fingers to bless themselves. And it must have changed after the year 1000 because when Russia was converted to Christianity in 988, they were making the sign of the cross with 2 fingers. So the 3 for the Trinity were down here, and the 2 for divine and human natures of Christ were on these fingers. And then when they tried to reform this to conform the practice in Russia to that of the rest of the Orthodox world, there was a schism over many things, many changes that were made in the services, but particularly the sign of the cross. The difference in the sign of the cross became the rallying cry for those who broke off from the main church. And those people are called old believers or old ritualists. And a lot of them have been reunited with the Orthodox Church at large now, because it was never a matter of theology, it was just a matter of ritual. But there's a famous painting of one of the schismatic leaders, a woman who was a noblewoman, being hauled off to prison in a sled, and she's making the sign of the cross like this to show her defiance. It's a very interesting painting. So, now let's move up to the iconostasis. I hope that as we're getting closer, maybe the people who are remote can hear us better. I'll try to talk loud though. You'll notice that the iconostasis, it's interesting, almost all our words in the church come from the Greek. So the word was iconostasis, which means icon stand, or a thing that supports the icons. And instead of iconostasis, the Russians lop it off and say ikonostas. Just like in Greek you say troparion, but in Russian you say tropar. They kind of leave off the ending. So you'll hear both expressions used. So the iconostasis in the very early church, there was just a railing there, kind of like you see in a lot of Western churches. You see an altar rail to separate the altar from the rest of the church. But as time went on and icons became more and more popular, they started attaching icons to those rails or to the columns that held up the dome. And so you have the development of the iconostasis. This is a fairly simple one. Sometimes they have more layers. If we had another layer here, probably we would put the icons of the feasts on it. And then above that, maybe we would have something like what is depicted up here. It's a composition in the arch up there is called the deesis, which means supplication or prayer. And the deesis is a composition that shows Christ in the middle, and always on his right, his mother, the Theotokos, the ever Virgin Mary, and on his left, St. John the Baptist, who are interceding for us with Christ. And then the other saints that we have depicted in our particular church up there are from left to right, St. Herman of Alaska, who was the first canonized saint in North America for the Orthodox Church. Next to him, St. Innocent of Alaska, who was the first bishop in Alaska. And later, I believe, moved his see to San Francisco. St. Herman was one of a group of missionaries who came in 1794. Alaska was then a Russian possession, and it was run by the Russian-American Company. And St. Herman was the last one to survive of that mission. Some of them were martyred, others just died in the course of time. But he was just a humble monk. He wasn't a priest, and yet he just won the hearts of the people by his loving care for them. And St. Innocent had a great vision for the Orthodox Church in America that it's interesting, his writings, he talks about he wants to go evangelize the Americans, by which he means the natives who lived in Alaska. And most of the native population in Alaska still is Orthodox, or they sometimes have missionaries who come in and try to convert them to different brands of Protestantism or what have you, but most of them, I believe, are still Orthodox. And then on the other side, we have St. John Kuchurov in the red hat, who was a priest who was the founder of Holy Trinity Cathedral in Chicago, or one of the founders. He was the one under which it built its present building, which was, by the way, designed by the famous architect Louis Sullivan. And St. John went back to Russia, and at that time the Russian Revolution had occurred, and he was the first martyr to the Soviet yoke, and the first priest to be martyred by the Soviets. He was leading a prayer for peace, an outdoor prayer service for peace in a park, and he was taken away and shot. And then on the right, we have St. Peter the Aleut. The Aleuts are one of the Alaskan tribes, the one particularly that St. Herman preached to and lived among. And he was martyred by probably some servants of Jesuit missionaries when he went to California for work. And while he was there, they tried to get him to convert to Catholicism. He kept saying, "No, I'm a Christian. I'm an Orthodox Christian." And he was martyred for his faith. Although there's also evidence that there were some cordial relations with the Jesuits in California, so my personal take on that is that probably it was some servants or employees of the Jesuits who did this, and not them themselves.
Did you say something about the doors?
Yes, we'll do that. In the middle of, well, let me back up first. Looking at the iconostasis, always Christ is on the right, and the Theotokos with the Christ child on her lap is on the left. And by the way, I don't think I ever talked about the word Theotokos. It means mother of God. You could translate mother of God, but more precisely it means the birth giver of God, because we don't want to give the impression that, that she's like a mother goddess who could give birth to a god in that way of her own accord. She is the one that God chose to give birth in human form to, the eternal Word of God. Okay, so I think it's very beautiful that here on the left, where we have the Christ child on his mother's lap, we have Christ as he appeared at his coming to earth as a human being. And on the right, we have Christ as he will appear in glory, because he's seated on a throne. And in the middle, we have where the priest comes out to give us Holy Communion. So there's his first coming, there's his second coming, and in the middle is his coming among us to share himself with us, to share his life with us in Holy Communion. So I think that's a beautiful way to look at this. On the angels who are next in line, as you go across the iconostas, those are the deacons' doors, the ones that have angels on them. And the angels symbolically represent, or the deacons symbolically represent the angels. Anybody know what the word angel means? Messenger, right. So as the messengers go in and out before the face of God to interact with human beings and to kind of help him rule the world, shall we say, so the deacons go in and out from the altar to the nave here to minister to the people. If we don't have a deacon in our church, if we did, he would lead most of the litanies where, we're responding, Lord have mercy, to different prayers that are offered. And you can recognize a deacon because when he is wearing his vestments for Divine Liturgy, he'll have a straight kind of robe, and then he'll have a stole. It's called an orarion, which means a praying thing, basically, a prayer stole, you could call it. He'll have that over one shoulder. Okay, so you can recognize the deacon because he has this diagonal stole on him. And while he's praying, he lifts the stole. I wish I had a piece of cloth here to demonstrate. He lifts the stole so it drapes over here to lead us in prayer, and that shape is like the wings of an angel. Imagine the wing extended to guide us in prayer. It's a beautiful idea. Now, we do have altar servers here who wear vestments when they celebrate the services. Some of them are subdeacons, and they will have a stole on, but it's crossed in back like an X. So that's how you tell who. The other people are just altar servers. They're lay people. Yeah, although sometimes it slips out, so it's not really very crossed in front. Yeah, that's true. Now I want to talk a little more about the royal doors. Oh, I didn't finish the iconostasis. At a prominent place on any iconostasis, you'll have the patron saint of the church. Since our church is a church of the resurrection, it's not a saint but an event, and since we had the stained glass window with the classical representation of the resurrection, which is the harrowing of Hades, Christ going down to liberate Adam and Eve from the kingdom of death and triumphing over death. Since we already had that there, we decided we would put another icon of the resurrection, which is the women coming to the empty tomb and discovering that Christ is risen. So that's our patron saint icon on the iconostas. And over here we have John the Baptist, who, as you'll recall, Christ said he was the greatest of those born of woman. So, if you're only going to have two saints, you'd have the Theotokos and John the Baptist, always. Now, in the center, we have the royal doors, or in Greek practice, they call them the beautiful gates, and they call the entry to the church the royal doors. But don't let that confuse you. In the Slavic practice, we call these the royal doors. At the top, can anybody recognize what the scene is at the very top?
Annunciation.
Yeah, it's the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel is announcing to the Theotokos that she would bear the Christ. And that's always present on those royal doors. And then down below, we have, in the center, we have the four evangelists, the gospel writers. And you can see each one of them is writing. And then we have over here on the outside panels, we have the saints who wrote our liturgies. We have St. John Chrysostom over there, St. Basil over here. His liturgy is used, I think it's 10 times a year during Great Lent and his feast day, and a couple of others. And then down here we have St. John of Damascus, who wrote many of our hymns, especially the Easter canon is the most prominent one I can think of. And then down there we have St. Gregory Dialogos, who wrote the pre-sanctified liturgy that we do during Lent. And then I wanted to talk about the icons a little bit. The Theotokos always has an outer garment or a cloak that's reddish or brownish, and then an interior garment that is blue, and blue represents heaven. So she's, her blessedness is sort of hidden beneath her humility. You could think of it that way. It's the meaning of the colors. And always, you'll see she has the letters here. It looks like MPOV, but it's mater. It's, again, the Greeks use the first and last letters of each word to abbreviate something. So it's mater, so it's like MR, and then that's a theta, which is a TH sound, Theu. And that little thing that looks like a Y or a V is actually an OU joined together. So it's Mater Theo, which means literally Mother of God. It's not the same word as Theotokos. It's a different title that we give her. And she always has red shoes. And she always has 3 stars on her garment, which represent the fact that she was a virgin before, during, and after the birth of Christ. So we believe in her ever virginity, which is the sign that Isaiah says, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and be with child." And when the group who translated the prophecy of Isaiah into Greek set to translate that, there's a tradition of the church that St. Simeon, the one who received Christ in the temple when he was 40 days old, St. Simeon was among those translators. And when he was translating, he said, well, a virgin couldn't give birth to a child, so I'm going to translate that as a young woman gave birth to a child. And then an angel appeared to him and told him, no, virgin is correct. So, and I think that's interesting. It sort of underlines the idea that while we believe all the Holy Scriptures are inspired, that doesn't mean that the person who actually wrote them down understood everything that he was writing. that God can act independently of the knowledge of the human author, which I think is a beautiful idea.
And so this, is it just our church's choice that we have the Lord's Supper above the royal doors, or is that everywhere?
It's very common. I don't think it's everywhere.
Every church has it.
Okay.
Last Supper.
Okay. Yeah, and of course that is the Last Supper over the royal doors. And then these icons, which are our newest icons, painted on the walls over there, are of the the 8 festal celebrations we have during the Sundays following Pascha, following Easter. Since our church is called the Resurrection, it's very appropriate for us. And then I wanted to talk about the altar table itself. Is Father around? Is he somewhere else?
Father Alex, are you in the office? Chief, we need you to open the doors.
Can you, would you open the doors for us? Okay. No one goes in the altar unless they have, a specific authorization to do so, and they have a real purpose in there. So you should never go in there just to yak or whatever. However, if you do need to tell the priest something, like, I don't know, God forbid somebody in your family fell ill and you want his prayers for it, and there's nobody to take up one of those lists into him, you could go to these plain wooden door over here and get his attention and hand him what you need to hand him. So. Okay. I just thought maybe you could show us the prothesis table and the altar table. Yeah, let's do that first. As I mentioned, before the service, the priest does a little, before the Divine Liturgy, the priest does a little preparatory service called the prothesis, and it's done in this area. So you can come on up here and peek in. Okay. See, I waited to get invited in. And so he's got a little cutting board there to cut the bread on. And I mentioned that he takes little pieces out for each person you've asked for prayers for. And there's all the implements that he uses. Yeah. Yeah, you can come on in. And don't look in that corner. Yeah. And by the way, the sink here does not go into the drain and a regular sewer or whatever. It goes to the outdoors so that when Father washes out the holy vessels after he's consumed all the gifts, no particles from Holy Communion will go just down the drain, but out to nature. And the same, like when you get the holy bread, you try not to drop any little crumbs or whatever, but if there are crumbs, you can take them and throw them out to the birds. That's considered a respectful and proper way to dispose of holy things.
We don't have a chalice. Chalice has the leftovers from communion. I don't dump none of this. I consume all of
Yeah.
this. And then that's washes up pretty much.
And if you speak up just a little so we can
That was Father who was talking. Okay. How about the asteriscos? There, maybe you could pick that up and just show us.
So what happens before the liturgy itself is, like I said, I have 5 cross-run breads that I use to assemble on this, we call this plate, a pack. And essentially, it's an icon of the church in bread. Okay? From one crossbar, I cut a cube that's Christ, that's in the center. And then after that, there's a vertical those commemorations are done, and then, people send in crossroads from outside, so those are done. And then the fifth bread, there is one big article associated with that, and that's for all of the departed of this life. And then I go through the list of those in my days of those that are departed. So family members, members of the church, members, of your families that you've asked for prayers for. So then, I should have mentioned it after the big cube for Christ is cut, placed on the center. That cube is pierced with this spear. So I put it under the IC portion of the bread. I say, one of the soldiers pierced his side with this spear, one blood, and one he was one witness, his witness is true. So then at that point, I poured wine and water on the channels. So that's how that is.
There's the blood and water.
So, and then it's after that. Then after these are all done, these commemorations, everything is covered. Star is placed over everything.
And he says words about the Star of Bethlehem while he's doing that. So often in many churches, there's an icon of the Nativity of Christ here.
Yeah, everything is accompanied by prayers or songs. Sorry, as I say that, it's over all of the rest. And then there are two covers that are placed over this with accompanying song verses. This goes chalice, and then over everything, this big, we call these all hairs. So then this is the very last cover that's supposed to go over everything. These covers over actually, it's a little detail. This is priest craft. But I mean, so actually everything is not fully covered in the sense that we need this flat up. Because the people send in breads and the first foot of the liturgy, so I still have to make congregations, it's not going to be possible to do that without any having to be pulled up. So, this is the way that things are covered. This is the access, continuing access to this.
Whereas when you start this and finish it, how long does it take? About half an hour, 40 minutes?
45.
So you start about 8 o'clock.
No, sorry. Quarter to as we start the liturgy.
And if you get here real early and it's real quiet, you can hear him saying all the names. And it can be moving because you hear names of maybe people you haven't seen for a while, because he remembers all of this. And by the way, the discos, the paten, as on it was written "Take, eat. This is my body" in Greek. I just happened to notice that while he was holding it.
Of course,
It rhymes in Greek. It's nice. Love it. If I get that.
There's an order to everything. I read in a book some years ago, there was a priest that he reversed how things were put on the pattern because it said, he understood completely the opposite of what it said.
Oh, he said on the right.
Yeah,
He
on the
he
right,
was
he
thinking,
put it on left,
yeah.
So, an angel told me.
Well, why don't you do an entertainment? And just so you know.
But it would still be valid. It's not like.
We often
No, actually, here's the story. I messed up. Somebody came in, another priest or a bishop came in and said, "Well, you have this backwards. You know, what are you doing? You have this backwards." An angel came to the bishop or the other priest. He said, "I would want to correct him because he's a priest. I'm only an
Oh,
angel."
wow.
And you know what? We're surrounded by angels. I remember Father Andrew Trekubov, who painted our icons. He's a deeply spiritual man. But he came into his church once and he was looking and he said, "I might have been
Oh,
So, and they accompany the priest when we go for the little entrance. That's where something like thy glory granted that we can enter the Lord just with us. Glorify him. So, we believe that angels possess.
You say those same finding angels are.
No.
You say that?
No, there's a prayer, the prayer that the angels would accompany the priest during that procession.
and during Vespers too, right? That with us?
Nothing, no
not
specific
specific.
mention of angels there, but at the liturgy for the little ones.
Okay,
I want
let's,
to go in front of the row.
Yep. Oh, and by the way, while he's doing that, this is a holy water font. We bless holy water once a year mostly, but there are other times it can be done too, at Theophany or Epiphany, January 6th. And it's a pious custom if you have to cross in front of the altar to make that sign of the cross, give a little bow.
So Anna said something I just want to emphasize. She talked about first advent of Christ and the second advent of Christ. And the altar is placed between those two advents. So that tells you where we are in the present day. We live in the present moment between those two advents of Christ. So the altar is regarded as the throne of God. In fact, you see up in the dome, there's an icon towards the altar itself. That icon is called the throne of God. It looks like a table. It's an altar table. Behind it is the cross, the implements of the crucifixion, and then what else is in
The
there?
dove of the Holy Spirit.
So it tells you what's going on there with the altar.
And gospel.
Yeah, so you see the altar table. In front of it is a little table that has a container with the nails, implements again for the crucifixion. And the gospel is there on the table itself, the angels to the right and to the left of the altar, and the dove in the center of the altar. So, and on the altar itself, we have the book of the Gospels. This is not the entire Bible. Okay,
some of the tombs might be out in the open, but it would be a place that Christians would gather. So.
It was also interesting, I don't know if this is really important to mention, but a lot of times on these tombs, there would be an opening in the altar that was constructed over the tomb, an opening that would go down, would be open into the tomb of the martyr themselves. And the way that we typically construct altars today, there is a central column in the altar, kind of mimicking that feature of the earliest altars. And actually, that's where the relic of the saint is, in the very center of the altar, in a little compartment. That during the consecration of an altar, once the relic is placed in there, that's sealed over with a special little cover, and that's sealed with mastic, which is like a mixture of incense, beeswax. I don't know what else is in there. It's like it's blue.
Yeah.
But not the Psalter, because
It
it's-
is.
Oh,
There are relics in there.
Oh, I thought it was only in the cloth.
No. I corrected myself. I said, because the altar is consecrated, so we do have relics in it.
This is the altar from the old church. Right, and it was consecrated back then.
Father X, what is behind the gospel book?
Okay, behind the gospel, let me
Oh, I wanted to use my picture. Where did we get the Antonuncium from? Where did
the bishop.
Okay, so he comes and physically brings it, gives it to you.
Yes, it does. When our church was consecrated, Archbishop Joe brought this ordinance, and he brought the relics which were enclosed in the Antonuncium during that consecration service.
I remember that. We had-
Yeah, and when this church was consecrated, the consecration of a church is a wonderful thing to attend. But I remember one thing that struck me is Father had a very long pole so that he could put Holy Chrism on all the walls of the church. So the way we're chrismated as Christians, the church is also
Well,
chrismated.
okay, I was going to mention about that. Both the church building itself and the altar table, when those are consecrated, we treat them like a person. Okay, in the sense that when the altar is consecrated, it's washed with water and with wine, and it's anointed with chrism. And when we consecrated this church building, we anointed all of the four walls at the highest point that we could go with chrism. So the church itself was like baptized and chrismed, just like a person.
Even the bells outside were chrismated, and they have names.
Yeah, they were named and they were chrismed, so we treat people with them because they have a voice.
Yeah, they're the voice of the earth. Sometimes they say, they talk about.
Behind the gospel itself, this is a simple little structure. It's a tabernacle, and you can have very elaborate tabernacles. On this tabernacle, it's simply a sick call. Inside it, there's a little container with the gifts, with the body and blood of Christ. That's
Will you take, is that the one you take with you when you go to the hospital and get?
this is excuse me, reserved sacrament. So this is just like at a pre-sanctified liturgy. To have that service, I have a lamb which has been consecrated at the liturgy before that Wednesday. When on Holy Thursday, on the day on which we commemorate the Last Supper, that's the day when we take part of the Eucharistic gifts and prepare them to be held in reserve for communion of sick people. So those are prepared on Holy Thursday, and they're held in reserve in this little container, and then also another sick call kit I have that I keep with me. So generally that lasts for about a year between these two sick call kits I have. Holy Communion lasts for about a year.
Can you just hold that up?
I'm not sure showing you everything.
I know.
There's a little. See, there's a little there's this little gold box on the top. This is called a pyx, and that's where the pre-sanctified body and blood of Christ is.
It's PYX.
Okay, so that's always kept on the altar.
And notice we have a 7-branch candlestick on the altar, like a menorah, like it was part of the furnishings of the temple in Jerusalem. And also something I wanted to mention that at the beginning, before I forgot, is that if you read the book of Exodus and Leviticus, Moses had all these elaborate instructions about how to construct the tabernacle, and those would later be replicated in the temple when that was built. And they were shown to him by God on the mountain, and God said to make all these things after the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. So these are not just human ideas about, how we conduct worship, but we have the idea in the Orthodox Church that we're, as Moses was, we're trying to replicate heavenly worship, which we're given hints of in the prophets and in the book of Revelation and so forth.
And that's an important one. Somebody will say to me, like after a liturgy or this or that service, "Oh, wonderful service." I generally say something like, "Well, I'm really glad I didn't have to write it or create it." This all comes from God Himself. I mean, not every little service, but the patterns for worship, like Hannah said, they're all divinely inspired by God and delivered to us through Moses. You might think that's a boring part of Leviticus, but it's actually very important.
Yeah, if you look at it with the eyes of, it's just kind of like what we do in church, it becomes more interesting.
Anything else you can think of?
I can talk about the icons. The icons on either side, we have a 2-part composition, which is Christ giving communion to his apostles. So there's, on each side, there's 6 of the apostles, and there's Christ giving the wine on one side and the bread on the other side. So because this is where we consecrate Holy Communion, that's an appropriate icon to have there. It might also, in some churches, that might be portrayed up on the walls or in another place. And then in the center, we have a separate composition that it represents the Holy Trinity. Originally, that icon showed Abraham and Sarah offering hospitality to the 3 angels who appeared to Abraham. And it's interesting because if you read that account in Genesis, sometimes he'll refer to them in the singular and other times in the plural. So we take that as symbolic of the Holy Trinity, those 3 angels. And eventually, it became so customary to use that as an icon that refers symbolically to the Holy Trinity that they left out Sarah and Abraham. And today, almost all representations of this hospitality of Abraham icon are like this, without Sarah and Abraham. It's just been sort of reduced to its essentials. And that's an example of how things change with time. In earlier times, you would always have Sarah and Abraham in the composition. It was a very literal picture of what happened in the Old Testament. But then a saint of the church, who was an iconographer, St. Andrei Rublev, painted a composition very much like this one. This is copied very exactly from it, which has become the standard that you see in most Orthodox churches.
There's a little detail in this icon, that this meeting with Abraham and the angels took place by the Oak of Mamre. It's right in the back there.
I love that.
And if you go to the Holy Land, you can see the Oak of Mamre, but we didn't see it when we went. Also, the opening of between the 3 figures is sometimes it's shaped kind of like a chalice. That would be, and also the figures sort of open to us. Notice where the feet are pointing. That's a characteristic of icons, where instead of photographic type perspective, where things get smaller and smaller in the distance, things converge, the lines converge not in a distant point, but in you, in the viewer. And it's called inverse perspective or reverse perspective. And you can see it here. I mean, you can see it here too. See how this little foot rest. I mean, if you were doing photographic type perspective, it would get smaller in the distance, but here the lines are converging toward us. And also, Father referred to the little central place in the altar where they put relics. This throne of Christ, this is very hard to notice, but it has 5 legs. Like an altar would have, sometimes would have another leg up through the center that would be what held that relic. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 feet on his throne. So his throne is like an altar.
It's not a mistake. As
Yeah.
one of our parishioners said, that icon is wrong. It's got a mistake.
I wouldn't have noticed that for years. And then also, again, we have the ICXC, abbreviation for Jesus Christos, on icons of Christ. And if you ever see an icon, there are 2 ways you can recognize it's an icon of Christ, if it's not totally obvious, is it will always have these initials. And in his halo, it has the Greek letters that spell haon, which means the existing one. That refers to God saying, when Moses asked his name, he says, I am. So, haon means basically, I am, the existing one. And also you'll see he always has a cross inscribed in his halo, which I don't think that's ever used for any saint. It's only used for Christ as far as I can remember.
And he has his hand in the blessing.
Yes.
Peace blessing.
And also the angels have little spheres that have those initials of Christ in them too. So their job is to proclaim Christ. And this is interesting too. You'll notice this icon of the myrrh-bearing women who came to the tomb of Christ. This one, her clothing is kind of like the Theotokos, but she doesn't have the 3 stars. And I don't know if some of you are familiar with the Search the Scriptures podcast. President Chiricini had an interesting discussion of, was the Theotokos one of the myrrh-bearing women? And she concluded that she wasn't, because she didn't need to go to the tomb to know he was risen. There's a tradition that he appeared separately to his mother. But she believes so thoroughly. But there are other fathers who say, oh yes, she must have been one of them. She was the one who is referred to as the mother of James and Joseph, I think it is. Yeah. So within Holy Tradition, which is a point I wanted to make in general that I maybe forgot to make last time, within Holy Tradition, there's freedom of opinion about a great variety of things. We have a lot of freedom to, use our reasoning and our researching abilities to find out things. And not all the fathers are going to agree on every point. Yeah. Okay, no, that one doesn't have the 3 stars, so they're very faint in these particular icons. Yeah, he can reach them better.
And on each of her shoulders.
You have to get up pretty close to see it.
Yeah, sometimes they're more obvious in some icons, but in any icon you'll see of her, unless it's very early. Sometimes these traditions weren't established until a little bit later. You'll see those 3 stars. Like if you see some very early icons, it'll show Christ without a beard. It's just sort of a, more common way that Greco-Roman people would not have facial hair. Also, I was thinking, I just happened to think I didn't mention when we talked about candles, the beautiful significance of lighting a candle. Of course, in the early church, everything that the church had to be brought by the people. You didn't just go to the liquor store and buy wine. The people would bring the wine. And we still, in the Orthodox Church, the people bring the bread. They bake the bread. And the bread that we use for Holy Communion is, it's just flour, yeast, and water, right? Nothing else. Right, Margot? Margot's one of our bread bakers. And Helen is too, yeah. And a little salt, that's right, because we're the salt of the earth. And it has a special seal on it, which has those initials of Christ. And when Father cuts the bread for Holy Communion, he mentioned that there's a part that's called the lamb. That's the part from which Holy Communion is taken. The seal shows where to cut out the lamb. So it has a cross and then an inscription on it of Jesus Christ conquers, which we abbreviate ICXCNIKA. And you'll see sometimes people write that in the stand on the candle stands, which is a lovely custom. You'll see it in a lot of Christian art. Jesus Christ conquers. ICXCNIKA.
Jesus Christ.
Conquers. Nika means conquer. Like Nike. It's a related word, right? Well, Nikes are named after a Greek goddess. It was the goddess of victory. So it is related. Yeah. Just some general remarks about Orthodox worship. Structure. We have all this structured ritual. We have all these things that are given to us. We don't have to make anything up. It's all there for us. And it's very deep and meaningful, and you can see all the meaning you can draw out of all these little details. And yet there's a certain informality to Orthodox worship. If there aren't enough chairs, people sit on the floor. There's an ease that we feel. And Metropolitan Callistos Ware, he said, there's this informality. It shows that Orthodox Christians feel that they're children in their Father's house. I thought that was beautiful. Sometimes our informality gets a little too much. I think we could learn a lot from the Roman Catholics about like being quiet before Divine Liturgy starts instead of yakking with each other. So, but I think there's always a certain informality, and the gestures the priest makes are more natural maybe than in some other traditions. I remember reading something by a priest who had been a high church Episcopalian, and he became Orthodox. And he said, when I was an Episcopalian, if I left my book on the opposite side of the altar from where I was supposed to be standing, I would like freak out about, how do I do this so it looks like it's part of the ritual? He said, now that I'm Orthodox, I realize I just go get it and bring it back. Although we have all this wonderful ritual, it's for us. The clergy is there for us, to support us. Also, our worship is very physical. All our senses are involved. The sense of smell with incense, and sight with all the icons, that taste with the holy mysteries of Holy Communion. Hearing, of course, with music, and touch. We kiss icons. So it's very physical. But there's no Christianity from the eyebrows up. And I think it's one of the things that immediately drew me to Orthodoxy. As soon as I saw an Orthodox service, I thought, at last I can express this physically, not just in my mind. And this reflects our theology, or I might even say our anthropology, our view of the nature of man. That we view man as not, as the Greek philosophers kind of envisioned man as a soul that was trapped in the body. And the soul was meant to be immortal, and the body was like a prison. And instead, in Orthodoxy, we see man as a unity of body and soul. That the fact that we are physical beings is part of our nature as human beings. It's what makes us human beings. And we were made in the image of God, so God himself, in the fullness of time, assumed this image of our physicality. God made man as a unity of body and soul and pronounced us very good. So good that when God became a human being, he assumed all of this. And we're different from angels. Angels have no regular physical body. They do have some kind of location, but they don't have a material body like we do. And even at death, the separation of our soul and body is only temporary. When the soul departs from the body, we're dead, and yet we expect that our bodies will be reunited in the general resurrection when Christ returns. So the separation of the soul and body at death is just a temporary thing. And who knows what that stretch between our death and the resurrection is going to be like. Maybe time doesn't exist in the way we know it here, so we can fall asleep when our time comes, confident of that resurrection. And when we say in the Creed, I look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. The resurrection of the dead is not just a spiritual thing, but a physical thing. Then our humanity will be again complete when our soul is reunited with our body. Another thing I wanted to mention is that Orthodox worship is practical. Most of the things we do have a practical origin. Like I was saying, the candles, you needed light. So people would bring oil for putting in oil lamps like this, or lampadas as we call them, and candles for other kinds of lighting. They would bring the bread, they would bring the wine. So all the things that make the sacraments come from the people. And if you have a parish where you don't have, people who are volunteering to make the bread for Holy Communion, the priest will sometimes make it himself. I've known priests who do that.
For many years, he was
Yeah. And now he's good at delegating, which is good. And I think it's a beautiful thing that, our worship, it may not be, for instance, our choirs, it's very important to us. Everything we do is very hands-on, that there's a lot of involvement of the people with the worship. And in fact, the priest is not allowed to celebrate the Eucharist alone. He has to have at least one other person here with him in order to celebrate the Eucharist. Which is unlike the Catholics where they're required to do Mass every day, even though they might be the only person there. So the members of the body of Christ and the specialized members we call the clergy are dependent upon one another. My husband likes to say, the bishop can't even get dressed without us because when the bishop visits, there's a very elaborate ceremony where they put all the pieces of his special vestments on him and so forth, and they all go with psalm verses. And at the end, the altar servers go and help him button up the robes and get the stole arranged and hand him his crown and everything, So I think that's a lovely thing about our citizens. Omophorian.
He's not able to put that on himself. He has to have assistance because it goes around and up and over, and it's buttoned a certain way. He literally cannot put the buttons on himself and get this stole over his shoulders properly. So it takes the assistance of us parishioners
Yeah.
to help him with that.
And by the way, since you mentioned that, I thought I'd mention here, the bishop saints have this white stole they're wearing is the omophorion. And in the early church, nowadays the bishop wears one that's brocade of whatever color it is for the season, but that's a late development. In the early church, it was made of white wool, and it represents the lost sheep on the shoulders of Christ. So that's a beautiful thing, that the bishop bears all of us on his shoulders. And also the priest today, Father, wears a stole that has many little fringes at the bottom of it. And those little fringes represent the souls that he's responsible for. And one of the reasons, when he told the story about the angel hesitating to correct the priest because he was a priest, our priests have to answer for each of us on the last day, as we have to answer for ourselves, but our priest will also answer for the souls in his care. So it's very important to pray for our clergy. And another sort of general principle of Orthodox worship I wanted to mention is when in Rome, do as the Romans do. If you go to another Orthodox church and they do things a little differently, blend in, do what they do. It doesn't, you don't have to be rigid about it, but, if they sit at a certain time, just sit. Don't, be humble about it. And actually the phrase, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, you might happen to think that that's just sort of an old saw, but it was actually the advice of one saint to another saint. When Saint Augustine wanted to go to Rome, he knew they had different fasting rules in Rome, so he wrote to his bishop, Saint Ambrose, about it. And Ambrose said, he says, well, should I keep the rule of fasting that I'm used to that's stricter, or should I do what they do? And Ambrose said, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So that's a good thing for us too. And also, do what you feel comfortable with. No one will judge you. If they do, that's on them. And things that may have seemed strange at the beginning, when you're not used to Orthodox worship, eventually come to feel right. So it's okay if there's a learning curve there. You need to get accustomed to it. And also, all the things we do in church out of reverence for God are not a good work that we're doing, to earn favor with God or anything like that. They're helpful exercises. They're things that help us to concentrate. I once heard a speaker who had taught at it was like an evangelical Bible college. And he had his students as an exercise. He said, okay, I want you to pray the Our Fathers sitting where you are. And now I want you to pray it standing up. And he waited for them to say it. And then he said, now I want you to get down on your knees and hold your hands out like this and say it. And they could feel the difference. So these things are there to help us, to put us in this frame of mind where we're open to heavenly things and can lay aside all earthly cares, as we say when we sing the cherubim. So I guess that sort of concludes my remarks. I'm sure I've left out things that I wanted to say, but it gives me a little time for questions. Maybe not much. Any questions? Yes?
Why does our church have bread and wine after you go to communion?
Oh, good question. Good question.
They don't do that.
Right. Yeah, that's not a universal custom. It's one of these things that's a local custom that will differ depending on the history of your church. The Greeks do not do that in their services. The bread and wine that are over there, now that bread is taken from the loaves that are prepared for Holy Communion, but it's not consecrated as the body and blood of Christ. So it still has a certain holiness to it, so you take it reverently. And you may take it home. You can take a piece home. And don't be surprised if you're not Orthodox and someone comes up and offers you a piece of the bread on their way back from communion. That's fine. They're not giving you Holy Communion, but they're extending this to you in love as something that has sort of a quasi-sacramental character to welcome you. Friendship bread, I heard somebody call it. I thought that was nice. Yes, Mike? Yeah. Yeah, there are probably, like many things in the church, this probably had practical reasons for doing it. There are two practical reasons that I know of to have the bread and wine over on the side. One is to cleanse your mouth from Holy Communion, so there are no like little particles that on your lips or in your mouth that might, get lost inadvertently, because we treat the body and blood of Christ with great reverence. If Father Alex were to drop some on a carpet, he would lick up as much as he could, and then he'd probably have to cut the square out of the carpet and burn it to reverently dispose of it. So we take it very seriously. We take the reality of that as Christ's body and blood very seriously. I know of a priest who spilled some of the wine from the chalice on a small child's shirt, and he had to get the mother to give him the shirt so he could dispose of it properly.
Just like during COVID, napkins that everyone used to wipe their mouths were burned.
Right, that's a good example. Okay, now I got sidetracked again. So one reason to have that bread and wine over there is to cleanse your mouth from communion. And in fact, one of our Slavic language speakers told me that it just means something that cleanses. You might say it's a chaser, sort of, for Holy Communion. And the other was probably that probably in the early church, they didn't have coffee hour. You had thousands and thousands of people, maybe in, the early days of the Christian Empire, who are coming to churches, so you probably didn't have anything to eat. So you might have come from a long way to get to church on foot, and so it's also to sustain you on the way home.
In the Jewish tradition, after the service, like for Sabbath service, they have loaves of challah that you
Oh,
bring off
okay.
and give
Oh, that's beautiful, yeah.
Yeah, and so just break it off and then give
Mhm.
your family or a friend a piece.
Yeah. Yes.
Can you remind me why in the Christ is portrayed as a man instead of a baby?
Yeah, why does he look like a miniature adult instead of a baby in the icons of Christ as an infant? I think it's just to show that he is God, that he is God, that he has the fullness of divinity in him, even though he's still an infant in the flesh. I haven't heard any other explanations of that.
The Theotokos, there's maybe one icon which she's always pictured with Christ. She was never, except in this one instance, where she's always pictured with Christ and not alone by herself. She's just inextricably linked.
Yeah, and I like in the Catholic Church, you often see statues of the Virgin Mary without Christ in her arms, but the ancient tradition of the Church is always to portray her with the Christ.
I think that's a really good thing that Protestants probably will pretty quickly notice. Hopefully you haven't never asked the questions, so thank you for asking it, Amy. But because even in some of the icons, Christ is, it doesn't even always look that clear. It does look like a child in that. And then sometimes they do Christ is pictured differently, maybe more like a baby, maybe more like a grown person. But it was always startling to me because as a Protestant growing up, we never saw Christ as a baby. It was always pictured Christ as an adult. So it just maybe we, from a Protestant background, have to notice that more. I'm more accustomed to it now, but I think it kind of, you don't even want to ask the question, well, does Jesus look like a man, but he's a baby?
Although you point out very aptly that some icons, like the ones we call the sweet kissing kind of icon, where he's like cuddled up to her, he looks more like a baby.
Icon where
Yeah.
he's hugging.
Yes.
Theotokos.
Yeah, there are so many different icons, and they all have names. I can't tell them all apart even. But here she's enthroned with him. Her body is a throne. We in fact we sing in one of our hymns, "He made your body into a throne."
There's a famous church in Thessalonica, in Greece, in Anna, went to on a pilgrimage, where it's one of the few icons of Christ without a beard. It was very striking, unusual. And one of the things, and it's much more desperate than an icon, but they're always not drawing the scale. The head is typically a certain portion of the whole height, which is never true. I don't think with standing.
Yeah, I think it's been a long time since I took art class, but I think the human figure is like 6 or 7 heads tall if they're a tall, stately person, and icons are often 9 heads tall. They're.
And that's another little study that
Yeah.
I said from iconography, and those iconography
And you can see, like, for instance, here's the icon of the Grand Duchess Elizabeth, who lived in the early 20th century and was martyred for the faith, and she's one of the ones in the antimensions that's on our altar. And we have photographs of her. And yeah, this looks a little like the photographs, but this shows her not as she was in this life, but as she is in the life she enjoys with Christ now, in the everlasting life.
She's not always working like that either. She's in many different ways.
Yeah. But you can see the resemblance still. You know, that of course depends partly on the skill of the iconographer and how much they want to emphasize the spiritual qualities and how much the physical qualities. It's a good example.
We need to get a new one though, because that sits in the sun and it's very funky.
They do fade. Oh, I promised you I'd correct a mistake that I made last time. I said something about, I didn't think there was anything in the 95 articles that Luther nailed to the church door that Orthodox would object to, but I went back and looked at them at the suggestion of my good husband, and actually they're all about the sale of indulgences. I didn't remember that from, I must have read them at some point, but it's been 20 years or more. And although there's nothing in there that, say, directly contradicts Orthodox doctrine and says that something about Orthodox doctrine is wrong, the whole approach underlying it really assumes a lot of notions that are very unorthodox, like the treasury of merits, the doctrine of purgatory, and the sale of indulgences. He didn't actually... He objected to the sale of them, but he didn't object to the concept of indulgences. Whereas, yeah, a lot, yeah. Yeah, so he's sort of assuming a Roman Catholic frame of reference, even though he's protesting certain things about it. And whereas Orthodoxy never had that sort of those notions. We just didn't see it that way. So, any other questions? We have a while before Vespers, so if you think of anything.
I just wanted to make one comment.
Yeah, comments are good too. Here, why don't you talk into that? So,
Anna said this several times, but when she was talking about when you enter the church, some basic things that people do, like we cross ourselves, we venerate the icon. And she pointed out the fact that, people do it, each person may do it just a little bit differently. And that's a beautiful thing for me as an Orthodox Christian, that there's no rule. There are certain things that are very, very important rules that are followed in the altar, like Father Alex pointed out to us. But how we pray is a very individual thing. We're given these tools, that help us show reverence to God or show reverence to the saints and Christ in the saints. But each person needs to pray how it is comfortable and meaningful for them. And I love that when I came to the Orthodox Church, I was never told, you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to do it 3 times, you have to do it 1 time here, 3 times here. You pray, you use the tools, you know what's comfortable for you, what you feel comfortable with, and that's how we pray. And I love that freedom. And I love watching other people pray, and I learned from how they reverence to help me in how I pray. But nobody has to do everything exactly the same.
yeah, thank you. That's a good point. And I wanted to say, some people, when they light a candle, they might make a little sign of the cross in the sand before they put the candle there. Some people might kiss the candle as they light it. It's a beautiful symbol of our continuing prayer. So next week, we'll do more of a sort of point-by-point comparison with Western Christianity and talk a little about the Orthodox mindset, or phronema. We always have a fancy Greek word for everything. So the word phronema for mindset. Okay,